I'm Ashley Elizabeth Best. I'm the administrative manager of the LCP. Um, I'm just going to little, well, not a little, an announcement here. Just going to, so I can read it properly. Just going to give a land acknowledgement. The League of Canadian Poets would like to acknowledge that this organization is situated upon traditional territories. The territories include the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. The treaty that was assigned for this particular set of lands is collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase and applies to lands east of Brown's Line to Woodbine Avenue, north towards Newmarket. The League of Canadian Poets recognizes the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land. The League also recognizes that art, poetry, and poetic practice related to the work of our organization takes place in traditional territories of many different nations. We encourage each attendee here today to learn more about the treaties and histories of Indigenous people tied to the lands where you live and work. Just realized you could probably see my mouse cursor going there as I was reading. Okay, stop sharing here. Okay, and just closing a few things here. And here I'm in Kingston, so I'd like to acknowledge the caretakers of this land, the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and allied nations, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy, which includes the nearby Mohawks and many other First Nations people who cross these lands for sustenance, trade, and survival. So welcome again. So today we're going to hear from Malika Sharma and Rebecca Salazar. We're going to start with Malika, and I'll just read her bio here and then I'll give her the floor. Malika Sharma is an HIV and infectious disease physician and clinician teacher at St. Michael's Hospital. Clinically, she focuses on caring for people and communities who are often marginalized and oppressed by our healthcare systems, including those who use substances and people living with HIV. Her teaching and scholarly interests center on anti-racist and feminist practices within medical education, harm reduction, and the structural determinants of health. Okay, so Malika, you can take the floor and I'll just spotlight you so everyone can see you a little better.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. I'm in Toronto, and so traditionally with the University of Toronto, we typically talk about acknowledging that this is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that it continues to be home to many people, Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. And I appreciate doing a land acknowledgement, but I'm increasingly trying to think about how to do it in ways that are meaningful and how to actually tie it to action after the land has been acknowledged, whether that's through learning, giving, donating, reading, learning, all of those things. But that's something that I'm trying to think more about. And, you know, in particular, I live near a river that's been very important to the peoples of this land for a very long time. And so particularly trying to learn about the history of this place in its specificity. So I want to thank you very much for having me here today. And I'm going to do something a little bit different in terms of what I'll talk about today. I really struggled with what to talk about in this setting and how to talk about it. And really more than any presentation I've given in the last little while, I really struggled with what to say. I hesitated as to whether to present slides or talk freely or to have myself be more scripted. I struggled as to whether to talk about my clinical work or my education work, or maybe not about work at all and about the parts of ourselves that exist outside of the medical space. I've struggled with the tension of wanting to share something of myself, but not wanting this to become a confessional or free therapy session for me that none of you signed up for. And what I finally landed on, and that I hope you are all able to take something from, is to talk a little bit about my experiences in medicine, how thinking about race and gender and queerness and class and parenthood has influenced that. And as a person who has tried to work through some of the experiences and traumas that come with being a clinician and patient, through theory and poetry and experience. So hopefully that sounds okay. I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. Thank you for the introduction. It's always so awkward for me to hear myself talked about in the third person like that. So you already know, my name is Malika Sharma. What isn't included in those formal bios is that I have two children, aged 4 and 10, and they are my absolute favorite. I am married. I am an only child and an only daughter. I am Punjabi, and although born on Turtle Island, which makes me both settler and colonized, I'm an infectious disease physician in Toronto, and as you heard, I care for people living with HIV. I'm a medical educator. A dear friend recently told me that it was okay to put the words feminist, writer, and educator in a bio for a piece we wrote about monkeypox and medical apartheid, so that felt pretty good. I liked those names for myself. I've also been told that having me talk about race or class or feminist theory is like going to Cosmo to read about Marx, which I think they meant as a misogynist insult, but I think it means that you're hopefully in for a treat. I am also a baby quilter, meaning that I've recently decided to take what my grandmother and mother taught me about caring for fabric and threading needles and weaving love through thread and teach myself how to quilt. It's funny because the place in the house with the best Wi-Fi is actually the laundry room, which is where I've set up my like little craft nook. So I'm going to talk to you about quilting, and I have it all beside me here. I sometimes feel like I'm in a rush to get to that old lady phase of my life, where I can sit in a rocking chair, fabric on my lap, needle in my hand, yarn at my side, and when I can just make things for people I love without anyone telling me that I'm late, without the fear that I missed something in the last consult that I did, without the anxiety of how I'm going to get the kids to school in time and still make it to my first meeting. My friends and mother have been asking why or when or how I can find the time to crochet or knit or quilt or whatever the latest project is. And I realize that maybe I'm trying to live that life in parallel to the one that I'm actually living. It also then dawned on me that quilting was perhaps a metaphor for my own experience. I am getting somewhere, I promise. Through my new quilting research, which, medical school habits die hard, so there's definitely been some research, I have seen some very fancy Instagram-worthy quilts. But my favorite quilts are those with unexpected fabrics, colors that clash just slightly, those with tiny errors where the quilter made one wrong cut and had to sew together two broken pieces to make one. I'm speaking from experience here because it took me a while to learn how to use that rotary cutter. Sewing these messy, mismatched pieces together to make one warm and complete whole seems like the perfect metaphor for my experience as a physician. Being a doctor mom, as it's sometimes called, is one block or panel. Being the daughter of immunocompromised parents is another panel. Being a wife in a dual physician couple, yet another block in this quilt. And being an infectious disease physician in the middle of a pandemic, another. Or maybe even 2 or 3 panels, if I'm being honest. So today, I'd like to show you these metaphoric panels, drawing on my experience, some of the things and theories I've written or read, and I eagerly await Rebecca's poetry, as I suspect it's going to add rich texture to the fabrics that I'm using. And as we look at this quilt together, I hope you'll forgive any meandering, any pauses over a stitch or a swatch that last too long or aren't long enough, because I think that messiness is also part of being a human who practices medicine. So let's look at the top left square of this quilt. So pretend with me here. All right, so let's look at this top left corner. The most salient features of our identities or lives differ for each of us, but for me, I will say that it is my identity as a mother that starts off this whole quilt. Several years ago, I wrote about my experience as a new mother in medicine, the ironies of being an infectious disease trainee who got 3 episodes of mastitis after returning to work because I didn't have enough time to pump. The surprising moments of solidarity I experienced as my always women staff would give me the keys to their offices so I could pump in privacy. The ragtag fabrics that make up this panel are messy and confusing sometimes, bits of bibs that remind me of my dreamlike maternity leaves, soft felts that remind me of the many nights I woke up repeatedly to comfort a sick little one, followed by exhausted days at work caring for people who are also sick, also loved. Small rips that have gone unmended for too long because I've been on service for too many weeks to fix them, until a burst of energy one weekend when I find my fingers covered in pinpricks from all the ripped pants turned into shorts for next season. Here is another panel, sari fabric, hand embroidery already 3 generations old. This is me as a daughter of immigrants, granddaughter of partition survivors. This panel is proud, joyful, Memories of a Punjabi truck driver reaching into his parked truck, pulling out a toll, and drum beating my walk up Yonge Street to St. Michael's Hospital. I lived with my parents during my first year of residency training, and that year I did 1 in 4 call, or 36-hour shifts every 4 days. My mother would pick me up from the GO train station with a fresh cup of chai and tell me, I spend 3 days fluffing you up like a towel, and every 4th day they wring you out and send you back to me like this. So there's some towel here too in this panel. That panel leads painfully to the next one made of the many, many cloth masks my mother made from old tablecloths. Masks that were rendered inadequate as we learned more about COVID transmission and reflected less about our priorities as a society. My parents are both immunocompromised, and that for me has been the single largest struggle as a healthcare provider. Protecting my family and my parents has become an overarching goal and at times overwhelming source of anxiety. As a healthcare worker who does not and largely cannot work from home, I have continually sent my children to school, where they are now the only ones masked. Selfishly, we also lost the weekly comfort of my parents, my children's nani nana in our home, comfortable, unmasked, free. We had years of short, cold porch visits telling ourselves, well, we've been so good thus far, what's a little longer? But a little longer has turned into a lot longer. And in many ways, the world has become even smaller for immunocompromised people in our communities. I have struggled with my feelings of anger and jealousy, of those who didn't spend days consulting on patient after patient after patient with COVID, using translation services for language after language, witnessing societal priorities and hierarchies play out in the ICU and on the wards. The work of disability justice activists and scholars, Mia Mingus and others, has brought me comfort and given me the scratchy realization that disability justice was actually a major gap in my knowledge, in my activism, and in my scholarship. But now it is hard to unsee, hard to walk back into the outside world and not feel rage at how willing we seem to be to make spaces and worlds inaccessible and even dangerous. Hard to channel that rage into something productive, something justice-oriented, and not just try to drown it out in episodes of RuPaul's Drag Race, which I've done a lot of over this pandemic. There's a lot of green in this panel. Green jealousy of those who can go to parties and not worry about COVID all the time, and hazy fabrics that reflect my earnest confusion. I sometimes can't tell if I've lost the plot or if I've just been really effectively gaslit into thinking that my concern and fear is overblown. But let's take a break from that panel and move down this quilt. This panel here is made up of the ways in which that rage has been channeled. May Day banners, protest signs, rainbow banners, cuts from the banner our friends made when our son was born that proclaimed it takes a community to raise a baby. In the second year of the pandemic, a dear friend of mine and I put weekly bitch sessions in our calendar. I hope I'm allowed to swear, I just did. In our calendar, texting each other on the days in between in a cloud of COVID service-induced exhaustion. At one point, with daycares closed, kids at home doing virtual school, and parents who were Lysol wiping their produce, we texted back and forth in irritation at the neoliberal discourses of women in medicine that failed to recognize the broader conditions in which women live and labor. The care work, raising children, cooking, cleaning, caring for elders, promoting health, and we didn't even mean by us necessarily, but the work that makes all work possible, including the work of women physicians like us. We took this text rant and we did the academic version of proposing to each other, will you write with me? Together we asked ourselves and our peers, to whom and for whom are we responsible? With whom are we in community? Beside that panel is more green, but the green here is pistachio, the color of my son's favorite ice cream, and the color of the scrubs worn by the trainees who have honored me with the gift of allowing me to mentor them, and my colleagues who have joined me in rage and comfort. Partway through the pandemic, and I realize I've started using this as a way of marking time, a brilliant medical student approached me with her alarm at the name and practice of pimping in medical education, a teaching practice where a medical educator asks increasingly difficult questions to trainees in a public and at times humiliating way. As racialized women, the term pimping struck us differently than it perhaps struck some of our other colleagues. And as racialized women, we tried to access and make the workings of power visible, to read up the ladder of privilege, to quote post-colonial feminist Chandra Talpade Mohanty. We wrote back and forth and through, coming to not only a critique of the practice and the name of pimping, but to envisioning something different, a transformative pedagogy working on the work of scholars like Bell Hooks and Ursula Franklin. This panel is covered with scribbles, words turned into paragraphs, text grants turned into papers, pencil smudges belying the ways in which we have been able to take our anger at the racism experienced by patients and providers alike, at the glacial pace at which institutions seem to change, at performance of solidarity, and through some alchemy, we turned it into words that we can share and speak into the world. Now let's look at the border of this quilt. I told you I'd be done early. Let's look at the border of this quilt. One of my closest friends has had a lung transplant. I happened to be on the Transplant Infectious Disease Service during her prolonged hospital admission a decade ago, and we would visit every day. I would do my clinical work and talk to her, and then we'd sit and chat. One of the many liminal experiences I've had on both sides of that invisible divide between those in bed and those at bedside. I recently told her that I'd taken up quilting, and she was thrilled. She'd always found quilts so beautiful, she said, and she wondered why more brown people didn't have them. It made me wonder, where did the idea of quilting come from for me? At work, the identity that I'm most comfortable with is that of HIV physician. In 1987, when I was the age my daughter is now, Cleve Jones, a human rights activist and author, along with other LGBTQ organizers, worked to create and display the AIDS Memorial Quilt on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., during the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. Its panels were made to be the size of a standard adult coffin. In 1987, it included 1,920 panels, and by 1989, there were more than 12,000. I am so fortunate to be able to work with people living with HIV, to hear their stories, to celebrate their triumphs, and to comfort them in their losses. I cannot claim what is not mine, but this history, these incredible acts of resistance and collective solidarity expressed by people living with HIV in the last 3 decades have been shared with me as a gift, and they have shaped who I am. I often try to erect firm, concrete boundaries between my work and my home lives, afraid that if I allow for any cracks, work will come flooding through and carry my family away in a tsunami of patient care and paperwork. But in connecting these quilts, the real one that I'm making using the skills and tools shared by my mother and grandmother, the metaphoric one that we've explored today, and the astonishing AIDS memorial quilt sewn out of devastation and loss, I recognize the threads that bind me together and make me whole. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow. That was amazing. I love the quilt, extended quilt metaphor and the textiles. I hope you write all of this down. Like, I would love to see this in print as well. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was personal and academic. It was a beautiful balance. Okay, I will introduce Rebecca and have her go, and then we'll open up for discussion. There's a smaller group of us, so maybe we can have some more time for that after. Okay, sorry, I will stop spotlighting here. Okay. There we go. So Rebecca Salazar is a writer, editor, and community organizer living on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik. Salazar is the author of 2 chapbooks, and her first full-length collection, Sulphurtongue, was a finalist for the 2021 Governor General's Award for Poetry. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I looked it up.
Hi, thanks. It's the territory is Wolastoqiyik.
Okay.
Yeah, the Wolastoqiyik people. Yeah, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Ashley and Malika. That was beautiful, and I need to thank you for saying so many of the things that I've been trying to say or been rage texting my own friends while also watching a lot of Drag Race. That has been like the thing that weirdly has sustained me through a lot of this pandemic, is just watching Drag Race over Skype with a few of the same friends over and over. We've lost count of how many seasons there have been of the show, but it's so many of that, like that's the background to all of these conversations we've been having about isolation and ableism and the ways that we've been kind of re-experiencing ourselves in a world that's definitely changing for the worst at the moment, but that could transform elsewise. So thank you for welcoming me into this conversation. As Ashley Elizabeth said, I'm on Wolastoq land next to the Wolastoq River, which is colonially known as the St. John River. I'm lucky to live close enough to it to walk by, and also I'm lucky to work with a lot of local Indigenous artists, both from the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq communities in this area. It's a strange thing to kind of learn your treaty responsibilities and enter into them and try to enter into them in good faith as someone who didn't choose to be here necessarily. I'm a child of immigrants as well, and my parents kind of moved here without knowing any of this background or the treaties that were active on the land they chose. And as a sort of second generation person here, it's both a pleasure and a constant state of learning and unlearning to kind of find good relations and meet the people who take care of this land. I am going to be reading a few poems tonight. I started the pandemic immune suppressed after a major health crisis in 2019. As I was recovering, the world shut down, and throughout these past few years, I found myself in that sort of gray area that's still high risk, even if I've slipped out of what at least this provincial government defines as immune compromised. So I'm not eligible for early boosters or anything like that anymore. And now I'm exhausted and terrified and have been writing a lot of really angry poems about this. I've been diagnosed with long COVID after having it once, which is now joining my list of many comorbidities. And I'm trying to find those moments of stitching the rage into something more transformative. So far that's turned into a lot of angry poems. There may be swearing, there usually is swearing. I'll mention too that my poems will talk about things like ableism and eugenics, suicide and depression, sexual trauma, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and they do include some mild body horror as well. I'm going to start with a poem that is relatively new called "You May Never Be Healthy Again." There was before the grounded lightning, and now after. Viral vectors swirl the clouds, the landscape altered, atomized. Reach for them. Jack Pine Sentinel and sprawling lake, a shallow channel and blackwater deeps. Rusted lily, reed and heron, scents of pine and swamp gas, clean water and murk, engender spiderweave to snare the memory. You may never see these again. No more homecomings for the healthless. Burnstar anise, firewood, pine sap, deplete hoarded stores in divine isolation, recall femme resilience, queer laughter, found family in isolation 3-4 years, the trauma bonds that graft us at the cut, the choice to keep on living, still dark water, jack pines groaning in the wind, release the histories that bind new growth. Brainwashing and abuse, immune suppression, mass pandemic, suicidal tendencies, ghost pregnancy, the CDC, MAID, PTSD, false objectivity, new disability. Lay down the sting of omnipresent death threat and release the voices you will not embrace again. Spent lovers, carers who abandon. I worry about you, little eye. Begin again the way new jack pines only grow after wildfire. As ecotones reclaim abandoned malls, as mushrooms bloom at Fukushima, you, the toxic resurgence, long COVID, post-viral rage, you writhe like pleasure after trauma, like the racked body deserves it. I'm gonna move from a quieter one to, this might be the ragiest of the bunch next. I read this for the first time at a Pride event here. That was the only one of maybe 2 events that I've been to that are masked and have air purifiers and free N95s at the door. Literary events have become nigh inaccessible, if not fully inaccessible, to a lot of people, and to me for a lot of the time since my book launched in 2021. And I could feel how many people in that room hadn't been in a room with other people for so long. I hadn't for quite a long time. So this poem was originally about something else entirely, and then had to take on this new strangeness, I guess. Anaphylaxis. Tell me I'm overreacting. This body refuses to breathe air with yours, to be co-formed by viral load, matter you would share. Lungs clutch, guts clench. There are alarming rates of gut disorders in the bodies of survivors of assault, racial or sexual, the body rejecting a world that will not let it live. What nutrition can a gut derived from whiteness and abuse? We shit it out before it touches us again, again, again. We cough and splutter, choke on back to normal, spit comorbid lives. And now all fibers of my being inflame, refuse assimilating proteins, begging, put me out of being. Imagine all the air you breathe, the food you ate was trying to eat you back. Wake every morning in a knot of chronic pain unfightable, as every organ self-destructs, as every tendon twangs to keep the body held together in one piece, as man hands grab, as anti-vaxxers grasp to claim a tract of land, a sickly morsel of control. This body is allergic to your world, and I am starving for connection that will not assimilate my cells, my will. Tattoo this spell in EpiPen and Pfizer on my seizing thigh. Mask up, fight AIDS and monkeypox and homophobia and long COVID, and fight forced pregnancies and detransitions, and fuck eugenics. When we ask for access, do not give us death for your convenience. When I ask for masks on, bodily autonomy, I dare you. Tell me I am overreacting, and just try to shove your matter down my swollen throat. The venue where I read that one the first time was a very small art gallery, and I think I was shouting by the end enough to hear an echo, which I don't do a lot. And I guess my living room doesn't have the same echo, so it's a little bit disorienting to read in front of my bookshelf and work desk. The next poem is an older one, but still feels relevant, and has to do with learning to live with trauma. And it was published in an issue of the Malahat Review a few years ago, in the queer issue, which was one of my very slow coming outs, I guess. I kind of didn't come out of the closet so much as just like lurked out eventually. So pain management. I'm learning to sit with my pain and not in it. The trauma doctor tells me to retrain my eyes so I can stop the blackouts. He tells me I've come this far. I have so few memories of him. It takes me hours each time to trust the man again. It's better than when it was. The healers who repair me from the damage done by men are other men. You grow the medicines you find. One tells me my riding hood conceals an AK-47, and the wolf I face should fear me, not me, it. Another reads my cards. In each inversion, he infers there is an elder I must learn from, not himself. Meanwhile, my elders die a continent away before I reach them. I eavesdrop now when strangers summon ancestors and hope their ceremony lends some echo of my own. I hold a seance seeking Jesus, who appears as twins, two lushly bearded queers who teach me how to resurrect, but Christ, somehow, I'm still not dying. The trauma doctor bandages our hands, tells me it's almost time to stop the biting. I can no longer ignore the bear chained in the yard who rages there for comfort, retribution. When I am ready, I must let the bear inside. When we are ready, I must feed us both. When I unchain us, I could hurt us all. Once in the house, the bear will break any precious and useless attachments to men. The men will hate this, all their fragile trinkets shattered. The men will hate me more. Until then, my pain and I lay side by side, make awkward talk. It's difficult not to lay blame on one another, but we try. When we hold one another, I fear she can smell the men's hands who marked me without asking. I fear too learning of her marks, of the men who imprinted so many of us. What if true love is loving women hurt by the same men who hurt you? What if forgiveness is letting men grasp their own handprints on you with some hope they will learn from it this time, like you are just the teaching aid they needed? My pain leans in to tell me my body cramps to leave us like I should have left the men. The bear outside says loving stands apart from needing to leave men, and I believe this but forget it. Someday, my pain will take her place outside and roar to rend the earth. When my body splits itself, I feel a power no machine gun could impart. I'm going to end with possibly the newest poem I've written in its entirety. A lot of the poems I had before I've rewritten into newer forms, but this is the only one that basically just jumped out fully formed. I wrote this when I was at the beginning of the pandemic. As I mentioned, I was recovering from a health crisis and immune suppressed, and I had flown to BC to go to a book festival. And after I landed, everything started getting canceled. It was mid-March 2020, and I could no longer afford to change my flight and go home, despite things being canceled, because everything was chaos and flights were being diverted all over the place to get people back into lockdown. And it was a really strange thing to be basically stranded on an opposite coast, but in a place that and relatively safe, despite being very scared. And talking to some queer friends and found family back here out east on the East Coast, I just kept feeling this longing to just be like in a place where I could stay safe. So I wrote this out of that weird state of isolation, pre-more isolation. State of emergence. New pandemic, and a porous body travels westward to sakura blooms impatient in the bud, itching to burst. A suitcase rattling with taro, steroids, vitamins, and herbs. A body barely cauterized and hypopigmented where weeks ago cracks oozed. Here lies a cross-coast convalescent wrapped in cold cotton for skin rash, full body eruption, soaked in premature sun, afterbirth of birdsong. Must the body fly this far during the harshest warming, COVID-19 warnings just to heal? Scarified fireweeds sprout from the left knee, that highway ditch death bloom breaks skin and leaves a body yet more open to contagion, reckless, buoyant with a second course of prednisone, and made defenseless by that medicine that keeps the eyes and throat from clamping access shut. I am compromised, biding long hours in an isolated lightscape, phototherapy, a loft bed where the moon beckons, skin charged magnetic with its tidal swell and slough. Pull a knight of pentacles, non-binary and backlit by the rising sun. They sprout two staghorn ferns from outstretched driftwood arms. This garden love too distant when the cardinal directions cease to mean, and viral vectors bloom geometries that isolate. Let us someday call this overcaution. Guide a body home and painless like an anxious lover hesitates, their salt-worn hands a soft remittance. Queer night, tend your quarantined garden until the bleak wind blows this bodiless skin shell back east to consummate our cracked embrace. With bladder wrack and aloe, let us cleanse the wounds we keep. Thank you.